A fascinating subject.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area.
It really is. We're looking at mixed Jewish-Muslim families in Israel.
Right.
And we've got this great research paper by Alice Gaya as our guide.
Yeah, she really digs deep into this topic.
She does, and it's something you don't hear a lot about, at least not in this much detail.
Absolutely. You mostly just get those very surface level stories.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that I found so interesting is how Gaia starts off. She tells this really compelling story about this couple, Khalid and Maya.
Yeah.
They meet while they're working at a resort town.
How interesting.
Yeah, and of course, you've got this immediate cultural difference. She's Jewish, he's Muslim, and, sparks fly in more ways than one, I guess, because they end up having a son.
And that's where it gets even more tangled, right? Because their story, like many others in the research, throws light on the unique challenges, but also the unexpected joys, I guess you could say, that come with this kind of intercultural relationship.
And you can't talk about those challenges without talking about the legal backdrop in Israel.
Oh, absolutely not. That's huge. In fact, when they decided to make things official after their son was born, they really hit a wall because Israel doesn't actually legally recognize interfaith marriages.
Wow, that's a big deal, that lack of civil marriage. It's like the system itself is pushing them into a corner.
It really is. And Gaia makes that point very clear in her research. This legal constraint ends up being a major factor for many couples. They're often left with this very difficult choice, like, do we convert? And more often than not, it ends up being the woman who converts to Islam.
Because it's less complicated that way, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
at least in the Israeli context.
Right.
And obviously that decision has huge ripple effects, not just for the couple, but for their families, for how they raise their children.
Yeah.
It just adds this whole other layer of complexity to the whole starting a family thing,
No kidding. And that's where, this whole concept of conflictual societies comes in, which, I'll be honest, when I first saw that term, I was like, ooh, that sounds a little jargony.
Yeah, it does sound a bit academic.
It does. But Gaia does a really good job of breaking it down. And it makes perfect sense, especially when you're talking about the whole Jewish-Muslim dynamic in Israel.
Right, because it's not just about, two different cultures existing side by side. It's about this really deep-rooted historical tension, this kind of push and pull that impacts every aspect of life. And that includes how families are formed and how they function.
So we've got this backdrop of societal and legal pressures, and I'm curious, how in the world do these families even begin to, create a sense of normalcy, a sense of shared identity within that context? How do they make it work?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is that Gaia's research actually uncovers these two really distinct paths that these families tend to take.
Yeah.
And she calls them the single identity and the hybrid identity patterns.
Okay.
And it's fascinating how things like, say, socioeconomic status
Yeah.
actually play a role in which path a family might choose.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. So tell me more about these two patterns.
All right, so the single identity pattern, you see this a lot with families from, say, lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And essentially what happens is that one spouse ends up fully embracing the other's culture. Like they completely adopt it as their own.
Wow, so it's like a complete cultural shift for that one person.
Exactly. A great example from the research is the Albi family. Maya, the Jewish wife, she converts to Islam, and then they actually end up moving to Khalid's Arab village.
Really?
Yeah, and their kids are now going to Arabic-speaking schools. Their whole life, their whole world really, revolves around this single Arab identity.
It's incredible. It's like they've traded one cultural context for another?
It is. It's a huge life change.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what kind of factors push families towards that all-or-nothing kind of approach? And that's where the socioeconomic element comes in.
Right, because it's not just about fitting in.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Especially when, remember that whole thing about the lack of civil marriage. It can leave families with very few options, especially if they're struggling financially.
Right.
Like the Albi family, they were facing some economic hardship. So moving in with Khalid's family, who, had this big supportive network in their Arab community, that became a lifeline for them.
So in a way, it's almost like a form of survival, right? Like you got to do what you got to do to make ends meet and find that support.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets even more interesting, because you might assume that, given the choice, most mixed families in Israel would just adopt the dominant Jewish identity.
Right. I guess so, yeah.
But Gaia's research actually challenges that assumption. She points out that for many families, especially those facing economic difficulties, those strong family ties within the Arab community, they're a huge pull in the other direction.
So it's not just about assimilating.
Not at all. It's about survival.
Yeah.
Having a community that you can depend on that will be there for you.
That's a perspective you don't hear very often.
Yeah.
Okay, we've talked about the single identity path. What about that other one, the hybrid identity approach? How does that work, and who is it that chooses that path?
You're right. Let's switch gears and talk about hybrid identity. This one's particularly interesting because it really challenges those neat and tidy boxes that we try to put people in.
Right.
And a perfect example of this is the Hatib family from the study. They present a really interesting contrast. They're more middle class, both parents are educated, and they're raising their kids with this fascinating blend of both Jewish and Muslim traditions.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's not about choosing one over the other. It's about embracing the richness of both.
Now, I'm really curious, how does that actually work in practice? Like, do they celebrate both sets of holidays? What language do they speak at home? I'm picturing utter chaos, but I'm sure they've got it figured out.
Right. You'd think it'd be this recipe for disaster, but they make it work. And it's all about navigating these, complexities with intention. For instance, the Hatib family, they actually do celebrate both Jewish and Muslim holidays. They want their kids to experience this whole tapestry of cultural practices.
I love that.
Yeah, and get this, their home is like a linguistic melting pot.
How many languages are we talking here?
So the kids in this family, they grew up speaking Russian with their mom, Arabic with their dad, and then Hebrew at school and with friends because they live in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. Talk about multilingual.
That's incredible. That's got to be like a workout for the brain.
Right. But it just goes to show you how adaptable kids are, how they can move between these different cultural spaces with such ease.
It's amazing. But it does make you wonder, though, what kind of challenges those kids might face growing up with these multiple cultural identities.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a really important point, and it gets to the heart of what makes this research so fascinating.
Yeah, like, are they straddling two worlds? Are they feeling pressure from both sides?
It's a balancing act for sure.
Yeah.
And, it brings up this key point about what Gaia calls hybrid identity, because it's not just about, blending cultural stuff at home. It's bigger than that. These individuals, they're navigating multiple identities, and it kind of depends on the situation.
Oh, interesting. So it's less about finding this like perfect middle ground and more about what, shifting back and forth between those different identities.
Exactly. Think of it as a dynamic process, almost like a dance between these different cultures, where they're adapting to the environment while also staying connected to their own, complex heritage.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it, but do we actually get to hear from these kids? Does Gaia give us any examples of like how this actually plays out in their day-to-day lives?
She does, and it's actually one of the most insightful parts of the research, in my opinion. She includes some really powerful quotes from the children of that Hatib family that we were talking about.
Oh, right, the ones with the like trilingual upbringing.
Yeah, exactly. And their words really paint a picture of what it means to grow up navigating those multiple cultural spaces. And you know what? They make it sound surprisingly easy.
You got to give me an example. What are some of the things these kids are saying?
Okay, so one of the sons, he talks about how natural it feels for him to celebrate, holidays with both sides of his family.
Wow.
Yeah. He describes like the joy of going to his Arab grandmother's house for these big, lively gatherings, with all the traditional food and the music and everything. And then in the same breath, he's talking about these smaller, more intimate celebrations with his Jewish relatives. And he seems to genuinely appreciate like the different vibes of each tradition.
That's incredible. He's not rejecting one or the other. He's embracing both, and he sees the beauty in both. It's almost like those labels Jewish or Arab. They just kind of disappear when you hear him talk about his life.
You got it. And that's what I think is so powerful about this research. These families, and especially the children, they're challenging those rigid definitions of identity that we've, kind of come to accept as the norm. They're showing us that it's possible to embrace complexity, to live in that in-between space where cultures intersect, and to create a new, more fluid way of belonging.
Makes you think about how much we take those simple check boxes for granted. Like, are you Jewish? Are you Muslim? These families are saying, hey, sometimes those boxes just don't fit.
And that's okay.
More than okay. It reflects a changing world, right? Where more and more people are like navigating these really complex identities. And I love that Gaia's research, it doesn't just try to explain these families' experiences. It actually pushes us to question those fundamental assumptions that we have about like identity itself.
Absolutely. Like, why do we even feel this need to categorize people in the first place, you know?
Exactly. It's like this research is telling us to rethink those categories altogether, to be open to the fact that identity is fluid, it's dynamic,
Yeah.
especially in a world that often feels so divided. But it makes you wonder, how does this actually play out in the long run? I mean, these families are dealing with a system that doesn't seem built for this kind of complexity.
You've hit on a really important point. This research, it gives us this amazing glimpse into these families' lives, right? But it also brings up all these bigger questions about the future.
Right.
Like what happens when those checkboxes, those labels, they no longer reflect people's realities? What happens when those in-between spaces become more and more common?
Yeah, I feel like my mind is already blown and we haven't even gotten to the end yet. So as we head into the final stretch of this deep dive, give me something big to chew on. What are some of the potential implications of all of this?
Okay, here's a thought. How might the growing visibility of these mixed families in Israel impact broader societal perceptions and policies going forward? Think about it. As these families become more and more common, they're essentially forcing Israeli society to confront those rigid definitions of identity that it's been holding on to for so long.
Wow. It's like their very existence is a challenge to the status quo.
It really is. You could almost call it a quiet revolution because you can't ignore something like that forever, right? Especially when it's happening right there in front of you.
And it's not just about how society sees them. What about the legal ramifications?
Oh, for sure. Right now, you're right. These families have to find ways to exist within a system that doesn't even fully acknowledge them. But as their numbers grow, so will their demands for legal recognition, for access to resources, for education that reflects their experiences.
It's like Gaia's research is just the tip of the iceberg. We're getting these little glimpses of these huge shifts that could be on the horizon.
Exactly. And that's what's so great about a deep dive like this. We're not just like learning facts and figures. We're opening up whole new ways of thinking about identity, family, even the very fabric of a society that's trying to deal with some really deep divisions.
It really makes you realize how much we can learn from those who are pushing the boundaries, who are living these experiences, and showing us that there's a different way.
It's true.
It's a good reminder to never stop questioning those assumptions, you know? Well, I think we've done some serious unpacking today. And to our listeners, I hope this has given you a lot to think about, maybe even challenge some of your own ideas about what it means to belong. It's like we're seeing the beginning of a societal earthquake or something.
I like that.
And those fault lines of identity, they're starting to crack.
It's an interesting way to think about it, for sure.
Yeah.
These families, just by, living their lives, they're forcing us to reconsider these really fundamental questions about who we are, where we belong, in ways we never would have imagined.
It's true, and it just shows you change often starts in those unexpected places. In the margins, where people are blending those cultures, pushing those boundaries. It's like these families, they're a microcosm of this much bigger shift that's happening everywhere.
Yeah, definitely. And as we become more interconnected, as those lines get blurrier, we've got a choice to make. We could either cling to those old ways of categorizing people, or we can embrace the complexity and see it as something positive, as a chance to grow.
Like that old saying, the only constant is change, right? And in this case, that change is pushing us towards a much more nuanced understanding of what it means to be a family, a community, even a nation. And that's what makes Gaia's research so powerful. It's not just some theoretical exercise. It's a call to action in a way, a challenge to look inward, examine our own biases, and be open to seeing the world in new ways. And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up for today. To our listeners, we hope this deep dive into the world of mixed Jewish-Muslim families in Israel has given you a lot to think about. Maybe even shifted your perspective a bit on this whole idea of identity. It's always evolving, right?
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep those questions coming, challenge those assumptions, and as always, keep diving deep.